Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to share watercolor tips for my own top 10 favorite bird painting tutorials. Some of these tips relate to painting the birds themselves, but there are a few that are more general painting tips, so many of these will help you no matter what subject you are painting. And definitely stay until tip number 10, where I will share one of my most favorite techniques for creating beautiful glowing watercolors. So let's get started with this top 10 tips list. Just so you know, I will link each of these videos in the description below, and I will also link my complete birds playlist up here in this top right corner. If you click now, it will play next after this video. First tip is from this Chickadee tutorial, and it is painting wet on dry. You can create this feather texture on the belly by painting with wet watercolors on top of dry paper. Make sure you leave some white gaps and paint small strokes in the direction of the feather growth. I'm also slightly splaying my bristles to get a more natural result, which also works great for animal fur. You can let your initial layers dry completely and add more watery layers on top, building depth and realism. Tip number 2 comes from my HummingBird tutorial, and this is using a contrast of dark and light to create the look of iridescent feathers. So how do you create the look of iridescence without adding sparkly paint? By first painting the light yellow-green of the iridescent neck and back feathers, and once dry, adding deep shadow colors right next to and around them. This contrast of light and dark helps to make the green appear to shine and reflect the light, creating that special iridescent effect. Another little tip in this tutorial is I glazed transparent green gold over those more turquoise colors, just here and there to add some more depth and realism to the final painting. Tip number 3 is from my Winter Robin tutorial. In this one, I used water drops on wet paint to create a snow-like background texture. So in this painting, I used gray background and added some texture by dropping water while it was wet to create the impression of snow. This is a fairly easy technique once you've gotten a little practice timing the wetness of the paper, since you want the paint to still be damp before adding the water drops, and then that ends up dispersing the paint. Also, if you can manage separate sections that are separated by foreground branches, for example, like I did in this painting, it will be even easier to manage the timing. And in this one, once the background was completely dry, I painted the foreground and bird in more saturated colors and with more detail to really bring them forward and make them pop from the background. And tip number 4 is from my Blue Jay tutorial. I created a bokeh or blurry background to suggest depth and bring the subject forward. So this is another background demonstration. I know a lot of artists struggle with painting backgrounds, whether to just leave it white or paint something detailed to go along with it, but I love a blurry background for a few reasons. Number 1, they complete the composition. Number 2, there's no heavy detail, so it doesn't compete with your foreground subject. And number 3, they are fairly easy to paint once you have a little practice. So in this Blue Jay painting, I used several shades of green, yellow-green, and some blue, and let them mix softly wet and wet. The different shades of green make the background appear to have multiple layers of depth, with the yellows coming forward and the deeper greens receding, and those bits of blue look like the sky peeking through. The tree and branch were also painted wet and wet, and I will link another tree branch tutorial in the video description if you'd like to check out how I create that mottled texture on tree branches. Tip number 5 comes from my watercolor dove painting, and this is painting a white subject using watercolor. When you paint a white subject like this dove, you need to find the right balance of adding enough color to create and define shapes, shadows, and dimension, but not add too dark of an application of color, or you'll lose the effect of the feathers actually being white. In this painting, I added just enough color on the whitest areas to suggest some feather texture, deeper color on the wingtips to separate the flight feathers, and deeper colors still in the shadows of the base of the wing to create depth. Another tip, if you paint a strong, saturated background, you will automatically create some contrast and it will help the subject to stand out even more. It's more difficult to paint a white subject against a light background. Okay, before moving on to the final 5 tips, I wanted to share my watercolor eGuide. If you are new to watercolor and you need some clarity on fundamental techniques, then I invite you to access my watercolor tips and techniques eGuide and video. These free resources will explain and demonstrate the most essential techniques for you to learn and boost your painting skills quickly. It includes a link to a video where each of these techniques are demonstrated. Plus, as an added bonus, when you sign up for the guide, you will also access a growing line art gallery where you can print and trace the outlines from many of my YouTube tutorials. Just go to createwithaura.com/free for all these resources. You can also click up here at the top right of your screen and it will open the link in a new tab for you. Of course, I will also have the link listed in the video description as well. Okay, back to the second half of my top 10 bird painting tips. Okay, tip number 6 comes from my Heron painting, and this is painting a moody composition using just one color. I painted this flying heron using only Moon Glow by Daniel Smith. Now, before you correct me in the comments though, I know I'm cheating a little because this paint is actually made from 3 different pigments, but this technique can be used with a single hue pigment as well. Whichever hue you use, choose a color that lifts from the paper so that you can remove to reveal highlights. When you use a single color, you rely on changes of value, which is the lightness and darkness of the color, to make the subject stand out. The background is soft, but the heron has the brightest brights and the darkest darks, and that brings it into the clearest focus and draws the eye to the subject. Tip number 7 is from my Bee Eater tutorial, and this is for creating an easy one-color background. So again, here's another background idea for your bird paintings that's very beginner friendly. Once the subject is completely dry, just paint clear water all the way to the edges or as far out as you want the paint to flow. Just make sure that it ends in a soft edge, so you want to wet it far out enough that where the paint travels, you won't have a hard edge. In this painting, I'm using green gold, which is a transparent color, and it also tends to flow really nicely on the wet paper. And tip number 8 is from my GoldFinch tutorial. This is one of my longer real-time tutorials, and on this one I show how to combine wet on wet and wet on dry techniques to create a sense of realism. So this goldfish was painted first wet on wet to establish the values early and some of the texture. I used brown by dropping it onto the light ochre color to create a soft textured effect. And once dry, I used a slightly more concentrated color wet on dry with this stippling technique, just using the tip of my brush and a light touch, with tiny little strokes in the direction of the feathers to create a realistic effect. You can achieve realism with watercolor without trying to make it look just like a photo. In fact, painting every single detail can make it look overworked and fussy. And tip number 9 comes from my Cardinal tutorial, and this is painting with red paint. I personally find yellow the most difficult color to paint with watercolors, but red is a close second because it can often be too intense to portray a natural subject. When selecting paint colors for this Cardinal, I had to make sure to choose a realistic natural red for the local color, or main color, and also a deep shadow color that would look natural with it. So for the primary color, I chose Scarlet Lake, which is pigment PR188, and this one is by Daniel Smith, and it's on the warm orangey side. You could also choose a cooler red depending on your reference photo. I also used one of my favorite shadow colors for most red and oranges, and that is Perylene Violet. This is a burgundy purpley color that is transparent, so it layers beautifully over the red to create shadows and separation. When you choose to paint a red subject, definitely test the pigment first on some scrap paper to make sure it will look realistic when you paint your subject. And last but not least, number 10. Now we've reached one of my favorite bird paintings and top tips for creating a beautiful glowing effect with watercolors, and that is using an underpainting. You may have heard of the old masters using an underpainting or a grisaille in oil paints, where they establish values using gray, then glazing thin colors of transparent paint over the top of it. Well, you can actually do this with watercolors too. Instead of using gray, you would use blue or purple. In this Flamingo painting, I painted an underpainting using a mix of French ultramarine and alizarin by Daniel Smith. I was able to focus just on the values, establishing the shadows and highlights in the first layer. It is really helpful since you don't need to focus on value and color at the same time. After this was dry, I layered my oranges and pinks, and the blue amazingly seems to disappear under those pink and orange feathers, looking just like a natural shadow color. If you want to learn more about how to use this technique, definitely watch the complete Flamingo tutorial, which I will link up here as well as in the video description, along with each of the other bird paintings from this video. Now, I would love to know, which of these tips do you think were the most helpful? Which ones would you use in one of your next paintings? And also, what other kinds of birds would you love to see in future tutorials? Please leave your comments below. I love to read your feedback. Thank you for joining me today. Please like and subscribe for more art tips, techniques, and tutorials. And don't forget to get your copy of the free Watercolor Techniques eGuide. The link is in the video description. Until next time, happy painting.